Welcome to Grain Rainbows, the podcast community for people coming out LGBT plus later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. For more episodes of Grain Rainbows, please visit my website at grainrainbows.com or subscribe in your favorite podcasting app. You can send me email at grainrainbows@gmail.com or submit voice feedback at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis. Grain Rainbows also has a Facebook community, and I'll tell you more about that later. My guest today is sociologist Arlene Stein. We'll be talking about her new book, Unbound, Transgender Men and the Remaking of Identity. I'll be back after the interview to share a few closing remarks and to let you know how you can become a part of the Grain Rainbows community. Have you ever considered hiring a personal coach? The key tool of coaching is asking empowering questions to help clients live more fulfilling lives. I'm currently training to become a certified professional coach, and I will begin to accept a limited number of clients in November of 2019. Until then, I will be offering a small number of free introductory sessions. If you think you might benefit from this approach, you can email me at grainrainbows@gmail.com. So welcome to Grain Rainbows, Arlene.
Thank you.
Would you mind starting out by just sharing your own story?
Oh, sure. I identify as a lesbian. I am, I would say, late middle-aged. I came of age in New York and came out as a lesbian in the 1980s in San Francisco. So I was part of that great wave of lesbian feminism and queer liberation, or we called it gay liberation at the time. At this point in my life, I live in New Jersey. I'm a college professor. I teach sociology. One of my main interests is in lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender studies. I teach at Rutgers University.
Great. Well, both my parents were from New Jersey, though I haven't spent much time there myself. So since I started podcasting in 2006, I've interviewed guests from a wide variety of fields, but you're actually, I think, my first sociologist. Would you explain, what a sociologist does? And then you can talk a little bit about your particular area.
What I tell my students is that sociology is the systematic study of society, whereas a psychologist might be more interested in individuals and in individual internal processes. A social scientist, or particularly a sociologist, would be more interested in how individuals understand themselves and construct themselves in relation to the groups that they are a part of, such as workplace, family, and in the case of the book that I'm going to be talking about and the work that I've done in relation to groups of people who identify on the basis of gender and sexuality. So whereas psychologists might be more interested in how people are shaped during very early moments in their lives in relation to their family, a sociologist would be much more interested in how that person is shaped in relation to other groups that they might be a part of and in terms of the social context in which they live. But, I wouldn't say that there's a hard and fast distinction between psychologists and sociologists. I'm a sociologist who is also interested in psychology. I've written a lot about sexual identities. My first book, which was published many years ago, was called Sex and Sensibility, Stories of a Lesbian Generation. And I was interested in a group of women, a cohort that came of age in relation to feminism and how they were different in terms of how they define their sexualities from the group that came before them. So basically what I was asking is, how did feminism remake lesbianism? How did it offer certain opportunities to people to identify in relation to their sexuality that weren't open before the advent of second wave feminism in the 1970s. And so I looked at the stories of individuals, how they came out, what it meant to them to be lesbians, and how that was shaped by the historical context in which they found themselves living in. Basically, in short, it meant very different to be a lesbian in the 70s and 80s than it did before then, because there were a lot of different new understandings of what lesbianism meant that were shaped by feminism. And so lesbianism became more possible to claim, became more possible to be a non-conforming woman in lots of different ways because of the circulation of these new ideas of what femaleness meant, what homosexuality meant, and so on and so forth. I'm interested in how social movements offer different ways of living. That's a theme that's run through a lot of my work, and how people come together in groups to redefine what different social categories mean, what homosexuality means, what lesbianism means, and now what transgender means.
Well, that's a huge, huge area. So today we're going to focus on your latest book, which is called Unbound Transgender Men and the Remaking of Identity. You want to give us just a quick overview of the book first, and maybe what is your target audience?
The book tells the stories of 4 individuals who found themselves together in the same surgeon's office in Florida a few years ago, all seeking chest masculinization surgery. So these were individuals who were assigned female at birth. 3 of the 4 of them decided that they were, in fact, transgender and they were undergoing gender transitions. One of them was a butch lesbian who simply wanted to get rid of her chest and wanted to masculinize her chest. They didn't know each other during this process. I was the only one who knew all of them and met all of them in the course of my research. And basically, I was interested in finding out why it is that they wanted to undergo body modifications, and what that tells us about shifting understandings of gender and sexuality. So I met them all the same day. They were all having surgery the same day, and I followed them over the course of the next year, looking at the challenges they faced in undergoing gender transitions, the different ways in which those, their understandings of self and identity change over time as they're undergoing bodily changes, and also figuring out how to present themselves to friends, family, and strangers in new and different ways. So it's a study of transgender men. It's also, an attempt to try and figure out how transgender individuals are challenging understandings of gender and sexuality that were constructed in the 1970s and 80s, partially through the feminist movement, as I was talking about earlier. The target audience of the book, it's written for a general audience. I'm a sociologist, but it's not written for an academic audience. I don't use a lot of jargon and big words on purpose, and I tell the stories of individuals in ways that are engaging and interesting for anyone to read. So I suppose, if I had an audience in my head as I was writing it, it would be people my age who might identify as lesbians or gay men who are trying to understand a new generation of individuals who may be more likely to identify as trans. It was written for friends and family members of trans or gender questioning people who have people they are close to who are thinking about undergoing gender transitions or are already doing it, who don't quite get it, who want to understand their family members and friends' decisions in a more, kind of nuanced way, who might be a little confused about transgender and what it all means.
Right. And I think that I fall in close to that first demographic, although I think I'm maybe a decade before you slightly. And then, of course, there's going to be those that are still just realizing that maybe they are trans and will be looking for everything they can find. I'm sure your book will be hitting that audience too. So Graying Rainbows is aimed at people who are coming out LGBT plus later in life. And it seems obvious that your book might attract readers who identify as trans. And I was going to ask you why you think that those of us who are coming out later in life, whether or not we're trans, what we would get out of reading this book.
Well, I think that anyone coming out later in life might be grappling with issues of how do I know that I'm really gay or lesbian? How do I know that I'm gay or lesbian and not trans? What does it all mean? What are these different categories mean? And what are some of the distinctions between them? I'm very interested in gay and lesbian and queer history. And I think that you can't really understand the choices that we as individuals make without looking at the social and historical contexts in which we come of age. So, for example, coming out in the 80s offered me different understandings and different ways of being that weren't available to those who came out maybe 20 years before. I think it was somewhat easier for me than it was for women coming out in the 50s, for example. Coming out in later life, I think, presents other challenges and possibilities. Maybe you've spent your whole life living in a heterosexual relationship and you decide when you're in your 40s or 50s or 60s or even later that you want to live in a different way. And for the first time, maybe you're able to do that. That's true coming out as gay or lesbian. It probably has some parallels to coming out as trans in that way. I mean, there are people who've spent their whole lives living in what we might call a heteronormative family structure and a heteronormative life, and then, say, a spouse dies, and for the first time they're able to act on their desires and dreams in ways that they weren't able to do beforehand. And I've heard of a number of cases in which trans people have done precisely that after a spouse has died, I'm thinking about one person in particular that I know who transitioned from male to female because they felt that for the first time they were able to do that. They didn't want to do it while their spouse was alive. So many of the same patterns and possibilities that gays and lesbians in later life who come out have experienced might also be true for trans people. I think there are lots of parallels.
Right. And it's kind of like, for me, I came of age in the 70s, didn't actually, I think around 1979, I suspected that I might be a lesbian, but since I was already married, I never did anything with it till after my husband died just a few years ago. But, if you're coming out at this point in time, all of a sudden there's this third choice. Am I trans? And I love the way that you sort of explored that question in the book. But let's back up and talk about exactly what top surgery is, since that's what your book is sort of focused on.
It was just kind of maybe incidental that I chose to study people as they were undergoing top surgery. I wanted a way into this world, this population, and it seemed to me that top surgery was a very important moment in terms of people's gender transitions, in part because a lot of the folks that most of the folks that transition don't undergo genital surgery. We tend to think of genital surgery as sort of the moment in which one passes from one gender to the other. But that's not really the case. Genital surgery, particularly phalloplasty, the construction of male genitalia, is something that is very, very risky, very, very expensive. Very few people undergo it. Therefore, chest surgery becomes the pivotal moment in which people experience their gender identity in a new way for many people undergoing body modifications. So basically, chest surgery is similar to a double mastectomy. Instead of leaving one with a flat chest, which tends to be what a radical double mastectomy does, it leaves some flesh. It tries to contour the chest to some extent to resemble a male-looking chest, a masculine chest. Most trans men and trans masculine people undergo chest surgery. It's relatively, any surgery is, complicated and expensive and somewhat risky, but it's relatively simple and straightforward, and therefore it's something that people tend to do. I ended up studying one particular surgeon in Florida who has developed an international reputation. Many people see him, and end up in his office from throughout the United States and even abroad because he specializes in this surgery. He's one of the very few people to exclusively do chest masculinization surgery for trans masculine individuals. I was very interested in this, seeing that a friend of mine had told me about. She accompanied a friend of hers who was undergoing surgery at this office, at the surgeon's office. As a sociologist, I thought it was an interesting phenomenon that I wanted to study, and I went down there and I ended up interviewing, as I said, the individuals, 4 individuals who are undergoing surgery the same day. And I also interviewed the surgeon, and as part of the book, I interviewed other surgeons and therapists and other people who work with the population of transgender people, and I interviewed trans activists as well.
What was the most surprising thing you learned from your research?
The vast majority of individuals at this office were young people in their early 20s and, 20s, early to late 20s. Many of them identified as lesbians before they decided that they were transgender. It was surprising to me how accessible the category, the label transgender was to them. They had access to a lot of transgender information on the internet. They were part of different chat groups and, had access to YouTube videos. They knew a lot about the trans world, even if they knew no other trans people personally. A lot of them were from small towns, small cities where they were relatively isolated. And when they found themselves in this doctor's office, often it was the first time that they had contact with other trans people. I thought that was an interesting and daring thing on their part, that they were able to make this huge life choice, life decision, and go against so many of the messages that they had received growing up about how they should be in the world as a female. And they were able to chart a course for themselves outside of those messages. And I thought, well, this is in some ways a much more radical departure from the expectations that people have around one than even identifying as gay or lesbian. I was very curious to explore that. I found that there were also lots of different ways of defining oneself as a transgender man. Some trans men have a pretty conventional understanding of what masculinity means. They're kind of macho guys who, resemble, in terms of their understandings of masculinity, any guy that you might find on the street. Whereas others have a much more critical understanding of masculinity and gender, and even are very ambivalent about masculinity and about being a man, and yet they feel very strongly driven to undergo a gender transition nonetheless, but they see it as something that they have very little choice over. It's something that they feel very driven to do. So we might think of transgender men as being a monolithic group, but actually there are huge numbers of different ways of being a trans man, huge numbers of different ways of identifying. There are different kinds of body modifications that people undergo. There isn't sort of one set script, although there are certain scripts that medical professionals follow. And there's a lot of diversity within this population, as there is among any population. But for those of us who don't know a whole lot about a group, we tend to stereotype and imagine that it's much more homogeneous than it is. So I suppose one of my insights is that there's a great deal of diversity, and I wanted to tell the stories of some of that diversity, although I only focus on one small corner of the transgender world.
Right. So my gut feeling is that a guy who becomes a woman gives up a lot of privilege. So their inner sense of gender mismatch must be awfully powerful, but that it would be much more complicated for a woman because there's always been women who passed as male so that they could live the life they wanted, but they didn't necessarily have a gender dysphoria. But now it seems like things are a lot more confusing.
What do you mean by confusing?
Well, let's take your chapter called The Last Butch Standing. So when I was a little girl, if you were a tomboy, no one really said it, but there was this little, say, if you stayed a tomboy past a certain age, assumptions might be made, right? Mm-hmm. And now it's like, okay, if you're kind of, I guess they now call it masculine of center, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're trans, right? Mm-hmm. So I thought about this quite a bit myself, just as a person coming out and saying, well, is this where I stop at lesbian? I'm pretty sure it is because I quit wanting to be a boy as soon as I started playing sports. But mm-hmm. I suspect that there's a lot of women who might be sort of in this, well, how far do I need to go place? Did you talk to anybody that fit that description?
All of the individuals that I interviewed, I focused on, as I said, 4, but I interview a total of about 50 people in all. But in terms of the primary interviewees, the 4 subjects of my book, all of them had identified as lesbians. And one of them continues to identify as a lesbian even after chest surgery. But just to focus on the 3 others who are undergoing gender transitions, what they told me is that earlier on in their lives, before they knew that there was a possibility of being trans, they thought that the lesbian label or identity was the only one that was available to them. Eventually, they realized that they could transition. They would say that in retrospect, that they were not really lesbians, that they were really trans people who didn't know about the possibility of transitioning. And people have different ways of explaining themselves and telling their stories. But the ways in which they distinguish themselves from other lesbians is that each of them experience what they describe as dysphoria. That is, even after they came out as lesbians, they experienced a great deal of distress in relation to their female identities. They felt that their femaleness was always somehow not a very good, sort of representation of who they were. So, for example, each of the three who underwent gender transitions would describe looking in the mirror and being particularly alienated from parts of their bodies that were identified as female, such as their breasts. They, at times, would talk about how difficult it was for people to refer to them using female pronouns when they felt that deep down they weren't really female. So they felt a sense of estrangement from their assigned gender identity in a way that most individuals who identify as lesbian don't really feel. And so that's what prompted them to go that additional many steps and undergo a gender transition. Now, are there many gay people who also experience gender dysphoria at various points in their lives? Maybe. But maybe it's a question of how extreme that gender dysphoria is and how extreme that sense of alienation from their assigned gender is. So for just speaking of myself, I might have experienced a sense of gender dysphoria before I came out as a lesbian, that I wasn't really a very successful female. But once I came out as a lesbian, I found that I was able to construct my femaleness in ways that felt satisfying and adequate. But many trans men would say that even after coming out as lesbian, they still felt this lingering doubt in their minds about whether or not they were really women. And oftentimes a sense of deep disgust and even hatred toward themselves in relation to their femaleness. That's something that I have never experienced. So even though I might have been alienated from my femaleness, I found a way of living with it and embracing it in ways that are comfortable to me. And that wasn't really the case for the individuals that I spoke with.
Right. So since I'm not a sociologist, I don't know if this makes sense or not, but it seems like this is a rich area that could be studied further, the difference between your inner sense of gender and not wanting to be conforming to certain expectations of performing gender in a certain way.
That's a really good point, that gender has internal and external components. And for the individuals that I spoke with, and I've never really thought about this before until meeting trans people, that some people feel very strongly gender identified in a way that I've just never felt. For people who are gender nonconforming, for some of those people, it's a very internal, strongly driven thing. And those of us who don't feel that way can't quite understand it. I certainly didn't really understand it until I started speaking with folks, and that was sort of the driving force for writing this book.
So one of the surprising, at least to me, twists in the story as you took the people past the surgery and watched how they grew was how their attitudes toward women and femininity seemed to change after surgery. You talked a little bit about their attitudes about what it means to be masculine, but what about their attitudes towards women when they became men?
Many of them felt this kind of alienation toward themselves and toward their bodies. It led them to devalue and disdain their own femininity and the femininity of some others around them. But once they transitioned, they felt freer in many respects, freer to value the femininity of others, and also freer to value their own femininity. They weren't as intent upon purging all traces of femaleness from their own bodies and from their own lives. They were more apt to claim certain aspects of femininity for themselves. So, for example, Ben, one of my primary informants, his story runs throughout the book, talked about before transitioning, he would never be caught dead with wearing any piece of clothing that might signal femaleness. He wouldn't even carry a water bottle that was pink because for him, that just symbolized femaleness, and he wanted to purge all of that from his own life. But once he transitioned, he felt this sense of liberation that allowed him to begin to claim his own femaleness, and he didn't feel quite as threatened by it. So one of the rituals that he talked about that he used to feel really coerced to do was to go with girlfriends of his to have their nails done. And I guess I didn't really know that this was something that people did in groups, but but it is. And he felt like pressured to go on these kind of girly expeditions to get his nails done with his friends. And after transitioning, he thought, oh God, glad I don't have to do that anymore. But then he began to reclaim aspects of that sort of former self of his. And, he even painted his nails once, I think it was like purple sparkly nail polish. And he felt that he didn't, because he had less to prove, it was such a struggle for him to perform femininity before he transitioned. After he transitioned, he no longer had to struggle as much in terms of performing a gender identity that felt somehow false. So he was able to be much more relaxed in terms of other aspects of his life. So pink water bottles were no longer verboten. Nail polish was no longer something that he would, shy away from, but he was able to sort of relax a little bit and claim different aspects of his gender identity that felt more comfortable for him.
So through doing this book, and also, I guess, as your teaching profession, you have a lot of exposure to younger people. What can those of us that are older learn from these evolving attitudes of the younger people about sex and gender? Is there any big lessons?
Younger people growing up today have many more choices, or many younger people, not all of them, but many of them have many more choices open to them and different ways of knowing themselves that we didn't have. It's partly through the internet. It's interesting and sort of freeing and liberating, but it's also at times a little bit confusing because there are so many more choices. There's a psychologist who wrote a book called The Tyranny of Choice. Sometimes too many choices are a little, mind-blowing, and sort of. So I would say that there's kind of an embarrassment of riches and different ways of positioning yourself on this gender and sex continuum that is open to younger people today. To some extent, older people too, but I'd say mainly younger people. Us older people are learning from this younger generation and challenged by them. And I think that we can learn from them just as they can learn from us. One of the things I've been thinking about recently is that there's so little interaction between older and younger queer, if I could use that term, generations. And what a shame that is. That younger people are basically doing their thing and we're doing our thing. And there are very few opportunities for us to interact with one another. I think there should be organizations, there should be structures that might facilitate that kind of interaction. I think your radio show is one, right? But, we need more of that.
Do you know about the Generations Project?
No, I don't.
I think if you just Google the Generations Project, you can find it. I interviewed the founder of it several episodes ago, but he's a kid in New York City. I think he's probably in his 30s, and that's exactly what he's trying to do. He's teaching people how to share their stories with each other. Have you seen the new version of Tales of the City on Netflix?
I've seen the first few episodes. I haven't finished it yet. Yes.
Well, one of the things that struck me about that was the way that they did present some of the conflicts between the generations. I thought that was very well done. So do you mind backing up and talking a little bit more about feminism here? I didn't even realize until I read Susan Stryker's book, Transgender History, about what had happened with regards to some extreme feminists in the 70s. I mean, I was alive during that period, but not exposed to that. And so it appears that there was a group of feminists who really discriminated against trans women because of political beliefs about it. So how would those same women have reacted to somebody who wanted to become a man? I guess they would have treated them like they were some kind of gender traitor or something.
Mm-hmm. The women that you're talking about, the sort of feminist activists who opposed trans at that point, were mainly focused on trans women, in part because there were very few out visible trans men, and in part because the context for a lot of those clashes were women's music festivals and the sense that trans women were somehow not real women and therefore should not be at those festivals, and that they were infiltrating these all-women space. Trans men have been less of a focus. They've been more integrated into lesbian and queer communities for a number of different reasons. Many feminists of my generation were just more confused about why anybody would want to be a man, because we had expended a great deal of energy trying to create women-only spaces and value women and glorify women's culture and women's community. It was a little confusing to us that anyone would want to be a man, even though men have more power in the world, because we had spent, a great deal of time creating a different world for women. Trans men weren't really on the radar of a lot of feminists who might have been ideologically opposed to transgender. And, now I think the whole discussion has moved on. I think people aren't quite as interested in drawing those kinds of boundaries as they once were.
Well, let's hope everything's moved on because it's time.
Yeah, we've got bigger fish to fry.
Right, yeah. One of the things I've noticed as a person trying to get into the LGBT community later in life is there still seems to be a lot of segregation between gay men and lesbians. And I'm wondering, from what I've read, does it relate to that feminism that was almost men bashing, men hating? I'm sure that's a two-way street, but I'm just wondering, does that contribute to some of the separatism that still exists?
Well, yeah, it's the separatism came partially in response to misogyny among gay men who didn't really want women as part of their communities. So it was a two-way street. Then, there were very few organizations and spaces that gay men and lesbians could coexist in. And I think that's still the case. I think bars tend to be single sex. Maybe that's not as true in smaller places where there's one bar in town and everybody mixes with everybody else. But I know that in larger cities, bars tend to be defined according to gender. Feminism might have been one contributing factor to maintaining a kind of separation among gay men and lesbians, but it's only one of multiple factors.
The reason that I asked that question is that I am trying to create a show that is for everybody, men, women, trans, and it's kind of challenging when you look at the culture and you realize that that's actually not the way it exists in the real world. There seem to be isolated pockets. So is there anything else you'd like to share, Arlene, before we close?
I don't think so. It's so great that you're doing this podcast. I think you're a real pioneer. So thank you for doing it.
Well, thank you for coming on. I think I might have to get you on again someday to talk some more about the whole sociology of the last butch standing, because that's a subject that I'm really interested in.
Sure, anytime.
I really enjoyed talking with Arlene Stein, and I found her book fascinating. You can find it on Amazon. It's called Unbound Transgender Men and the Remaking of Identity. No matter how you identify, I think this book will broaden your perspective. Please let me know what you think about graying rainbows. You can send me email at grayingrainbows@gmail.com or voicemail at speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis. You can also leave comments on the Graying Rainbows website at grayingrainbows.com or on the Graying Rainbows Facebook fan page. If you want to join our private Facebook group, the easiest thing to do is to go to the Facebook fan page and click the link you will see to the right of the Graying Rainbows logo. Recently, quite a few people have submitted requests to join the group without answering the questions. Those questions are there to protect the privacy of everyone in the group. So if you don't want to take the time to answer, please at least indicate that you listen to the podcast and tell me what your favorite episode was. And also, please indicate whether you are over the age of 30. If you happen to be younger than 30, you need to send me a private message. Midge Noble is helping me keep up with these requests, but we can't approve people who don't provide at least a brief description of why they want to join. Also, I would love to feature more listeners on Graying Rainbows, so please email me if you would like to share your story. If the idea frightens you, remember that your story could be a lifeline for someone else. I'm also happy to share anonymous emails for those of you who need extra privacy. Before I close, I want to thank you for listening and sharing Graying Rainbows with others. I'm still sending out Amazon gift cards to everyone who sends me a screenshot of their iTunes review. But word of mouth is probably more effective. Also, since I'm not very good at social media, I really need your help to get the word out. You can also help the show financially via patreon.com. This is a website that allows you to make a monthly pledge. Just go to patreon.com/graying rainbows. Your pledge will help offset the cost of producing the show. Right now, the biggest expense is audio editing. So whatever you can contribute, it is appreciated. I'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Graying Rainbows. But in the meantime, I hope you'll check out my other podcasts, Books and Ideas, and Brain Science. Thanks again for listening. Graying Rainbows is copyright Virginia Campbell, MD. You can copy this show to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grayingrainbows@gmail.com.